Uh, so, uh, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the second edition of the CSP African Philosophy Summer School, hosted by the Conversational School of Philosophy, Calabar, Nigeria. In July 2023, we had the first edition, and the feedback was overwhelmingly very positive, and we decided to have it again and continue expanding the frontiers of African philosophy. And today we continue on that trajectory. And the first summer school introduced us to knowledge of African philosophy, the introductory discusses on African philosophy. And I'm very excited that we're gradually shifting the focus of the discussion now to some real fundamental issues in African philosophy. We are no longer asking those questions regarded as perverse dialogue, questions of what is African philosophy. We are now dealing with some fundamental applications of African philosophical theories to practical problems. So the theme of the second CSP summer school will be focused on African metaphysics and artificial intelligence. And we have a great lineup of lectures for you over the course of the next 3 days. We encourage you to participate, engage with the lectures, ask questions, reach out to the lecturers after the lectures. And also, we have other platforms that are available for conversations. We have channels on Slack. If you haven't joined the platform, please feel free to join our Slack channel. Some conversations will be going on there. The lecturers are also encouraged to join and share the materials you have with the students on the Slack channel. And also, we have a YouTube link. I'll also be checking for those that are joining via YouTube. If you have questions, do well to drop it in the comment section. And please, we encourage everyone, once the lecture starts, you should mute your microphone and listen so that you don't interrupt the lecturers. Before I open up the floor to our first lecturer for the day, um, I would like to invite Dr. Aribia Davidato from Vita University in South Africa to give us an opening remark as a representative of the Conversational School of Philosophy for today. Dr. Aribia, if you're here, please, the floor is yours now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Patrick. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Very briefly, without wasting much of our time, I'd like to welcome everyone to this school. We are happy to have you all here as participants, and we are particularly grateful for you to register and attend this summer school. Without you, the summer school would not exist. And also special thanks to all the lecturers who will be teaching and participating in this summer school. We are happy to have you here. So as Patrick said, we are going to be focusing on specific aspects of African philosophy, African metaphysics, which is quite frankly an underexplored, under-researched area of African
Dr. Otto, I don't know if you're still there. Your network seems to be having a little issues.
and we hope that by African students and African philosophers to focusing on African metaphysics, and we also be focusing on trying to see the links between
Um,
Yeah, Patrick, can you hear me now?
yeah, I can hear you now.
All right, so my network is a bit dodgy, so I'll not waste any of your time. Welcome, everyone. We are happy to have you here as both participants and students. We'll be focusing on African metaphysics and AI, the links between those two themes. And we have a great lineup of lecturers. I'm hoping that this summer school will be useful to most of you and to encourage further research in the underexplored areas of African metaphysics and African views on artificial intelligence. So thank you very much. On to the first lecturer for the day. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Atto, for that introductory remark from the Conversational School of Philosophy. So I think we'll move right into it. Our first lecturer, if you're ready. The first lecturer for today is Dr. Adielu Oyekan. Dr. Adielu Oyekan is a researcher with the Decoloniality Research Group in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And he'll be taking us on the first lecture entitled Overview of Traditional African Metaphysics. Dr. Oyekan, if you're around, please, the floor is yours now. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
Oh,
we can hear
that's
you.
great.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm struggling with my PowerPoint here. If I can share in the course of the presentation, I will. If I cannot, please bear with me. I'll try to be a bit slow as I can so that I can get some of my points across. Yeah, so let me begin by appreciating the Conversational School of Philosophy for the invitation to be a part of this second edition of the summer school. I consider it a very laudable initiative that helps to remind us of our core callings as philosophers and then deepen our groundings. It is not just for the benefit of those who have registered to be a part of this school. It is also for those of us who have been invited, who are privileged to be resource persons. Because sometimes some of these things, yes, you think you know them, they are in it, but when you go back again, you find yourself, being re-educated sort of. So it is my hope that over the next 3 days, we'll have very fruitful interactions, all of us leaving the summer school enriched. So I have been asked to do an overview of the concept of metaphysics from the traditional point of view. So I assume that many of the things that I will be saying will sound familiar to many of us, even if our research paths have since gotten diversified based on our research interest. I start by saying that the study of metaphysics is often regarded as a study of first philosophy because it deals with the most fundamental questions concerning existence, reality, and the nature of being. The conventional literature tells us that the philosophical interrogation of metaphysics was first initiated by ancient Greek philosophers, particularly the Ionian philosophers, the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers. Their focus on metaphysics was basically aimed at trying to understand how the world works. And in the quest for that understanding, they ask fundamental questions such as, what is the primary source of existence? What is the world made up of? Why is the world like this and not like that? What is the central substance, if any, that unifies all of existence? In response to these questions, there were different answers based on diverse perspectives. For instance, argued that the primary substance of all things is water. Yeah, and he arrived at that choice by observing that water is essential to life, it exists in multiple forms, and underlies nourishment and growth. So for him, it was rational to conclude that it is the originating principle of the cosmos. On the other hand, Anaximenes proposed that air is the fundamental substance, suggesting that through processes like rarefaction and condensation, air transforms into other elements such as fire, water, and earth. His own idea reflected a more dynamic principle, air being invisible yet ever present, expansive yet capable of becoming tangible matter. For Anaximander, however, he introduced the idea of the apeiron, meaning the boundlessness, meaning the boundless or the infinite. He reasoned that the origin of all things could not itself be one of the things in the world, which is finite or determinate, but it must be something beyond limits and opposites, from which all opposites, such as hot or cold, wet and dry, etc., emerge. So the hyperion is not air, neither is it water, but an indefinite source that gives rise to all things and into which they eventually dissolve. His view showed something that is somewhat more abstract in the human approach to the understanding of cosmological composition. After him came Anaxagoras, who introduced the idea that everything is in everything. And by that, it means that the universe is composed not of one or few elements, but of infinitely divisible particles, in which a portion of everything exists in everything else. So this was how Anaxagoras tried to make sense for diversity and change without abandoning the idea of unity. So, for instance, when a seed grows and becomes a tree, it reflects the potentiality of all things that is latent within a minute speck, made actual by the ordering force of the mind. So his own theory was a response to the inadequacy of the single substance explanations that preceded him. And he tried to preserve the notion of complexity and coherence in metaphysical inquiry. So from the foregoing, we see that the early metaphysicians differ in their postulations on the primary substance.
Excuse me, Dr. Oyekan. I'm sorry to cut in. Please, can you put on your video for us? Thank you.
Okay. My video here. Do you see me now?
Yeah, we can see you now. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. So I was saying that, so from the foregoing, we see that the early metaphysicians, they differ in their diverse postulations on primary substance. What we can deduce, however, is that they share the common goal, which is to trace the visible complexity of the world back to an underlying or unifying principle. So whether it was Thales flowing water, Anaximenes' air, Anaximander's boundlessness, or Anaxagoras' all-in-all theory, we see that each view represents an attempt to reconcile change, stability, diversity, and unity within the cosmos. So, for example, when we observe that rivers shape the land, and waters waters nourish our crops, and the human body is largely made of water, we attempted to understand why it is, reach the conclusion that water is primary to existence. So when we similarly notice that breathing gives life, winds, the breeze plays a very significant role in altering our climate and ensuring our existence. We have an understanding of Anaximenes. And so we can go on and on with all these philosophers and see that they tried from their own limited perspective to identify what they consider as the primary force that shapes the essence of all things. So in all these thinkers laid the groundwork for metaphysics by refusing mythological explanations and by presenting natural and at the same time rational accounts for the origin and structure of reality, which we mostly regard as the bedrock of metaphysics to date. So, based on that, we see that the study of metaphysics is one that transcends empirical inquiry, and it has, traditional metaphysics has laid the ground for works on metaphysics in modern times by probing into the conditions that made our experience, knowledge, and even identity possible. So, although we can distinguish between metaphysics as practiced, or as done in the olden times, in the early times, with what obtains now. So, metaphysics broadly insists on engaging with the underlying structures and conditions of all empirical knowledge. So, the traditional scope of metaphysics also includes themes such as being, causation, substance, universals, determinism, the notion of the divine, and many more, all of which are not merely abstract pursuits. Rather, they deeply influence our understanding of not just the cosmos, but our sense of morality, human comprehension, and even cultural experiences. So, from an etymological point of view, we've been told that metaphysics originates from the Greek word meta, which means beyond, and physical, meaning physical. So the combination of meta and physical gives us metaphysics that was used to describe originally the works of Aristotle after his treatises on physics. So we can then say that metaphysics etymologically refers to the study of what lies beyond the physical, although Aristotle himself did not use the term. I think what he used was proto-philosophia, so which he defined as the study of being qua being, that is, being so far as it is being. So this conception in the Aristotelian sense positions metaphysics not just as an ontological endeavor, but also as an epistemological one, because it seeks to examine the general features of reality, such as substance, identity, time, and space, as well as the principles that structure all of existence. So we see that metaphysics, while it has been described as a speculative endeavor, it is also an inquiry into the transcendental structures of cognition and existence. In spite of its abstract and foundational nature, we see that it seeks to probe into the totality of existence, which encompasses not just the physical, but what lies beyond it. Of course, this attempt has received some backlash when we cast our minds back to members of the Vienna Circle, for instance, the logical positivists of the early 20th century. What they did was to try and dismiss all forms of metaphysical inquiries. We remember David Hume, who asked us to commit all such inquiries, into flames. We remember Carnap and members of his school, who argued that unless a proposition could be tested through sensory experience, it was basically meaningless. Despite all these criticisms, metaphysics has continued to enjoy some level of intellectual legitimacy, and although, like Dr. Arabia mentioned, it's comparatively under-researched, but it is also that which has refused, to go away. So as such, metaphysics remains an enduring and dynamic field that continues to inform and intersect with other disciplines in philosophy and beyond. So from that background, we can then take a cursory look at some of the concepts that make metaphysics tick. The concepts that you cannot escape dealing with in your engagement with metaphysics. So one of them, I will discuss a few of them, not necessarily in the order of priority. And I will start with the notion of ontology. So ontology is one of the core areas of metaphysics that deals with the nature of being and existence. Its focus is primarily to ask foundational questions, such as what does it mean for something to be? So in the Western tradition, ontology has been central to philosophy since the time of the pre-Socratic philosophers. So we remember, for instance, Parmenides, who is widely known for arguing that only being is and non-being is not, which means that we should discard the notion of becoming, which basically is is the rejection of the law of the excluded middle, or rather the removal of a middle ground. So according to him, being is one and it is unchanging as it is eternal. There is no space for becoming. Whatever is does not go out of being, and whatever is does not come into being. So the state of becoming, according to Parmenides, does not exist. Building on this rigid position, Aristotle tried to develop something that is a little bit flexible and classificatory. He proposed that entities are substances which possess various properties and can undergo change while retaining their core identity. So for Aristotle, substance is the primary category of being, and everything else, such as quality, quantity, and relation, becomes a predicate of it. This clever maneuvering by Aristotle allowed him for a distinction between what a thing is, which is its core essence, and the properties it can gain or lose. So we remember some of the instances we were given when we were back in school. And we talk about a tree, for instance. So a tree is cut down. We now make tissue papers out of it. We make our shears. We make rulers. We make pencils. So it all of those things are diverse manifestations of it. What a tree is retains of a tree, although it can change in what Aristotle tried to do was to preserve for us to have the notion of change within the idea of stability. So there are modern ontologists such as E.G. Lowe, Peter Van Inwagen, who have continued the ontological project by seeking to map out the categories of existence, whether material, mental, abstract, or social. So their works extend ontology beyond just physical substances to include possible objects, causal powers, and even fictional entities. So from an African perspective, we see that ontology relates to the notion of relationality. So if we look at the Akan and Yoruba worldviews, for instance, we see that being is not defined merely by individual existence in concrete form, but also through communal relationships and participation in spiritual reality. So a person, for instance, as portrayed in these perspectives, is not just an individual with properties, but a being constituted in relation to the community, ancestors, and divinities. So this idea of communal ontology sees identity as something dynamic and participatory rather than static or individually enclosed. If we extend it further, in Eastern ontology, such as Buddhism and in the Vedantic systems, we see a challenge to the very idea of stable or enduring entities. So in Buddhism, the doctrine of anatta, which is non-self, denies the existence of any unchanging essence, suggesting instead that all phenomena arise through dependent origination. And what this means is that everything exists only in relation to other things and conditions. So similarly, in the Avatar Vendetta, Brahman, which is considered as the undifferentiated absolute, is the only thing that is real ultimately. So the multiplicity that we experience in the world, including our sensory experiences, are considered illusory. That illusion is called Maya. In other words, this perspective maintains that reality is one, unchanging and eternal, and that all diversity and change are mere appearances. So away from ontology, there is also the concept of universals. The idea of universals is a central problem in metaphysics, which considers issues such as whether general properties like redness, beauty, or justice have an existence independent of the mind and of particular instances. So over time, we've seen classical responses to these questions, ranging across fields such as realism, nominalism, and conceptualism. So, taking a look at Platonic realism, for instance, we see a view that universals exist in a non-empirical realm of forms, which are only accessible through reason. We see that in Plato's Republic. Aristotelian realism, in contrast, holds that universals exist only in instantiated form within particular things. That is, universals like redness exist, but only as they are manifested in specific red objects and not in a separate realm. So we see that Aristotle again tried to strike a balance between the core and the diverse manifestations. So, in the medieval period, a lot of thinkers attempted to synthesize Aristotelian realism with Christian theology. So they argued that universals are grounded in the mind of God and that their intelligibility comes from God's rational order. So, for instance, Thomas Aquinas maintained that universals exist in three ways. They exist in things, one, that is, they exist in the mind post-rem and in the divine intellect ante-rem. So we'll see that in the Summa Theologia. Moving to modern philosophy, thinkers like David Armstrong defended realism from a scientific standpoint. He posited that universals are necessary to explain the laws of nature and the similarities among particulars. So, for instance, the fact that multiple copper wires conduct electricity is not merely a coincidence, but because they all share the universal conductivity, that is, the capacity to conduct. So, on the other hand, philosophers such as William of Ockham rejected the independent existence of universals. He argued that universals are mere linguistic conveniences, names we use to group things together, but they have no existence outside our mind or the language we use to describe them. So this view is known as nominalism, and it denies the ontological status of universals and sees them only as mental or verbal constructs used for practical classification. In Africa, we can say, of course, it is agreeable that universals are seen as embedded in communal categories. So, for example, concepts such as an elder, who a chief is, or who an ancestor is a function that manifests ontologically through collective recognition and ritual. They are not treated as abstract, disembodied entities in the Platonic sense. Instead, their being is deeply tied to communal validation and functional relevance, according to Kwasi Uredu. So African ontology tends to emphasize the dynamic and relational aspect of categories, where status and roles emerge from social embeddedness rather than from abstract qualities. So from the Eastern tradition, especially within Buddhism, there is a strong denial of the ultimate reality of universals. The Buddhist doctrine of Sunyata, which translates to emptiness, teaches us that all phenomena are empty of inherent essence, including the so-called universals. They argue that conceptual universals are mental impositions on a world that is ultimately devoid of fixed identity. So in this sense, universals are treated as useful fictions, but we are made to believe that clinging to them as real leads us to the misunderstanding of the true nature of reality. So this takes me to the notion of God in metaphysics. So from our discussion about ontology and universals, we already see that there is variation in the perception and understanding of these themes, even if they all feature. So there is no difference here when we come to the idea of God. So the place of God in metaphysics varies across traditions too, but it also remains central to any inquiry into the ultimate causes and foundational reality of the world we live in. So in Western metaphysics, God is conceived as the necessary being, the uncaused cause, and the ground contingent existence. So in the work of Aquinas, we see the argument for God as ipsum esse subsistence, being in itself, not just one being among others, but the very act of existence. So rationalist philosophers like Descartes and Leibniz view God as the guarantor of the rational order of the universe, providing both its logical structure and its metaphysical grounding. So for Descartes, God's perfection ensures the reliability of human reason, while for Leibniz, God chooses the best possible word from among all conceivable ones. So it comes down and down like that to Kant, who argued that we cannot have theoretical knowledge of God's existence, but we must assume God in order to make sense of our moral duty and understand the sense of justice and the highest good, which is the summum bonum. In African metaphysics, the supreme being is both transcendent and immanent, revered as the ultimate source of all existence, yet also deeply embedded in the workings of everyday life. Often, this divinity, as we know, is mediated through spirits, ancestors, and natural forces. So, take Yoruba philosophy, for instance. Olodumare is recognized as the origin of all being, but he acts through intermediaries such as the Orishas, as the gods, who carry out divine functions in the world, according to Wande Abimbola and Bolajido. So this layered structure reflects metaphysics where God is not distant, but is interwoven with communal, ethical, and ritual life. Divinity is understood not only as ontological, but also as functional and relational. So in Eastern tradition, we see a different tone, in which Buddhism, again, for instance, typically has no belief in a personal creator called God. Instead, the ultimate reality is described in terms of impersonal principles such as sumvata, emptiness, which implies that all phenomena are devoid of inherent existence and arise through dependent origination, as earlier mentioned. So similarly, in Taoism, we see that the Tao is not a God, but the underlying principle of order, harmony, and spontaneous flow in the universe. So in the Vedanta, Brahman is not a personal deity, but the undivided, unchanging, infinite ground of all being. So it transcends name and form and is considered the only true reality, with the multiplicity of the world seen as Maya, which I have earlier described as illusion. So across different traditions, we see that God or the divine is conceived through diverse metaphysical lenses. While Western systems often emphasize God's personhood, will, and moral agency, African and Eastern traditions tend to highlight metaphysical unity, cosmic function, and immanent presence. Yet, in all these perspectives, we see that the concept of God serves as a pivotal anchor in understanding the structure and origin of reality. This brings me to the notion of spirit-based causality in both African, Western, and Eastern thought. So, spirit-based causality represents an alternative to mechanistic causality and finds expression in diverse cultures. So, to fully appreciate its significance, so let's begin again from Western philosophy. So the idea of causality itself is a very influential one. It's a very controversial one in philosophy. We remember David Hume's argument who famously argued that our idea of causality is not derived from reason or logic, but from habit or custom. So according to Hume, we never perceive necessary connection between events. Only what we perceive is only a constant conjunction of events, such as the sun rising every morning, which now leads us to expect a particular outcome, every time. So for him, causation is psychological, not metaphysical. It is grounded in the human tendency to associate repeated experiences. So this led to a skeptical view of causality as something inferred rather than known with certainty. However, spirit-based causality departs radically from this empiricist approach. It maintains that events are not merely the result of mechanical sequences or mental expectations, but that they are deeply embedded in spiritual and moral frameworks. So in many African traditions, for instance, causality is understood not merely in terms of physical processes, but as driven by spiritual agents, gods, ancestors, spirits, or wishes who affect the course of events in the world, in the visible world. Illnesses, misfortune, social disharmony, in fact, success, and many other phenomena are frequently traced to spiritual causes. And when things go bad, people look towards explanations such as offenses against their ancestors, the violation of taboos, or the envy of some malevolent agents. We can see that in the works of Igbafe and Oyekan in 2017. And they observed that in African communities, taking the Edo people of Nigeria, for instance, causality is moral and intentional. A person who falls sick may not consult a medical doctor, to cite one example, but first a diviner or a priest who is expected to discern the spiritual imbalance and then prescribe the ritual redress. So the question then is not just about what happened, but what caused it to happen. So if, for example, somebody dies suddenly in an African village, it may not necessarily be interpreted as a result of heart attack or accident. So the question is, why the heart attack? So that's why you see that communities and individuals try to seek spiritual explanation as to whether somebody has offended some spirit or some elders or broken a taboo. So the explanation lies not in impersonal sequences, but in the intentional act of visible or invisible agents. So this view integrates cosmology, morality, and community life, making causality not only metaphysical, but also ethical and relational. So in Western philosophy, René Descartes posited a dualistic interaction between mind and body, where mental intentions could cause physical events in the body. So this effectively then opens the door to non-material causality, though it is still within a philosophical framework. We see the works of other philosophers such as Marley Branch, who developed the idea of vocationalism, a doctrine that denies causal power to creations altogether. So according to Marley Branch, it is God alone who causes all events, and what appears to be interactions between physical bodies are merely occasions for divine intervention. In instant thought, causality is a bit more abstract and non-theistic. Buddhism, for instance, as I have mentioned earlier, is underpinned by the idea of dependent origination. And this explains that all phenomena arise in dependence upon conditions. Nothing exists independently and nothing arises without cause. However, this causality does not involve a personal agent. It is a systemic web of conditionality in which everything is interlinked. Similarly, in Hinduism, we see karma operating as a moral law of cause and effect that transcends a single lifetime. An action performed in this life, good or bad, produces consequences in one's future life, weaving morality into the very structure of existence. So in Taoism, Tao is the generative force that gives rise to all things. While it is not a personal deity or conscious will, it is a principle that governs the flow of nature and society through effortless harmony. Effortless harmony is described as way. So, we see that African metaphysics therefore emphasizes personal spiritual agency, gods and ancestors and wishes, Western traditions have oscillated between divine intervention and mental causality, and Eastern systems present a framework of impersonal and processual causation. In essence, spirit-based causality reinserts meaning, intention, and morality into the heart of metaphysical explanation, especially in Western and African thought system. Now, I would also like to talk a little bit about determinism. Determinism is the doctrine or the idea that all events are causally determined by prior state of affairs, thereby posing a challenge to our notion of free will, moral responsibility, and the intelligibility of human action. So, in Western philosophical canon, determinism gained prominence with the rise of Newtonian physics, which portrayed the universe as a closed, mechanistic, and causally ordered system. In the works of Spinoza and Leibniz, we, however, find elements of deterministic metaphysics, which is grounded in the idea of divine rationality from God's nature. So for Spinoza, of the divine nature and human freedom in understanding this necessity. So, of course, we see those who hold diverse views. Prominent among them is David Hume, who challenges the notion of determinism, or who challenges the notion that determinism necessarily undermines moral responsibility. Hume tried to explain determinism from a compatibilist point of view, maintaining that there are some of the outcomes we see in the world, but that our free will is not necessarily abrogated. So he talked about the causal necessity of actions flowing from one's character and intentions rather than from external coercion. So the notion of determinism is also interwoven with the idea of destiny when we come to the African thought system. So among the Yoruba people, for instance, destiny, which is referred to as Anyomo, is considered preordained, chosen by the individual before birth in the presence of the deity or Orunmila. However, and there has been a division among the Yoruba scholars on whether this generally accepted way of choosing one's destiny now means that determinism should be interpreted in a very hard way, which inevitably takes us to fatalism. The idea that we cannot alter anything or that we are not responsible for anything, or soft determinism, which now opens a little window to say, yes, whatever it is that we are going to be in the world has already been determined, but we have a little window of manipulation through human cultivation, choices, and divine favor that can be gotten through sacrifices and propitiation. So we see that within the context of determinism, destiny operates as a metaphysical structure, according to self-determinists in Yoruba thought system, in a way that allows personal agency to still play a vital role. So in Eastern tradition, there is an attempt to integrate determinism with moral and spiritual agency. For instance, when we look at the doctrine of karma, the doctrine of karma tells us that every action has consequences. So it is one that establishes a deterministic but ethically structured universe. Karma functions as a moral law rather than like a blind force. It links the present conditions to past choices. However, we see that both Hinduism and Buddhism emphasize the notion of liberation, which is called moksha in Hinduism or nirvana in Buddhism. You attain nirvana when you have purged yourself of all your accumulated karma. So, and this is attainable through ethical discipline, spiritual insight, and detachment. So this implies that while causality governs the realm of action called samsara, higher forms of consciousness and realization can transcend deterministic chain. So in Taoism, the deterministic flow of the Tao guides existence, but harmony through way brings freedom, not by resisting causality, but by aligning oneself with its spontaneous reading. So, so I've tried to cover the idea of determinism and destiny in one breath, but permit me to also mention that in Western metaphysics, the idea of destiny has often been tethered to divine providence or historical necessity. So when we look at the works of Saint Augustine, we see that he regarded human history as unfolding according to God's eternal and unchanging plan. Of course, that's a little bit close to that of Leibniz, as we have said. He sees it as it's a perspective in which every event, however tragic, finds ultimate meaning within the cosmic order. So this theological determinism finds a parallel in Leibniz's assertion that God, in his perfect wisdom, has chosen the best of all possible worlds, where even apparent evils contribute to the greater harmony of the whole. Of course, we know that some modern existentialist thinkers have challenged this metaphysical narrative of destiny. In the works of John Paul Sartre, we see the rejection of the notion of a pre-given essence or divine plan. Sartre argued that existence precedes essence, which means that humans are not born with a fixed identity or purpose, but must create their own essence through choices and actions. So from this existential perspective, we see that destiny is not received but constructed. It is not given but willed into being. Therefore, across different traditions, we see that destiny serves both as a metaphysical anchor and a point of existential rebellion. So in African and Eastern systems, destiny harmonizes divine order with human effort, while in Western traditions, it oscillates between theological determinism and existential responsibilities and then transcendence. So in all, we see that when we talk about metaphysics, especially from the traditional point of view, the questions about what reality is made of, how we can interpret the world we live in beyond the things that we see physically, that we can account for empirically, are ideas that permeate the thought of different cultures. Like I have said at the beginning, what conventional literature tells us is that metaphysics began in ancient Greece. But from what we have seen here, we have seen that every culture has always had that sense of curiosity to know what lies beyond the physical. So what differentiates what has happened? I mean, the notion or the approach to metaphysics in Africa, for instance, from what obtained in the West is that there was a written tradition, and
Hi,
they were
Dr.
able to.
Oyekan. You have 5 minutes left. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to round up now. Yeah, so I was trying to say that the urge to philosophize, to gaze into nature and wonder, and to try to seek rational explanations for things that are both physical and the ones that are not physical, are not exclusive to a single tradition. So what we've seen in the West is that there's been a longer and more consistent, pattern of written documentation of these experiences and observations. But we have also seen that other cultures where from China to Japan to India down to Africa, wherever human beings have been found. Yeah, this curiosity, the inclination to ponder and to reflect, is innate, and it has always been manifested. And one thing that I would also like us to take away as I conclude is that yes, metaphysics may not have been prioritized by scholars because we live in a world today that is very materialistic, and our quest for survival on a day-to-day basis means that we tend more to deal with the things that we see around us. But ultimately, that human quest to even explain things that happen around us, whether in the political sense, in our understanding of the moral universe in which we live in, or they eventually find a way of placing their ways back, to these metaphysical questions about the ontological status of not just human beings, but also, the world in itself as one big phenomenon. So I think I will stop there for now and then take questions if there are any. Once again, I want to thank you for listening to me.
All right. Thank you so much for your presentation. All right. So after listening to that thought-provoking presentation, it's time for us to entertain your questions now. And feel free to raise your hands and ask the question directly, or you can drop it in the comment section. I'll be more than happy to read them out to the lecturer to address your questions. In the meantime, while others are trying to gather their thoughts to put together their questions about traditional metaphysics. Okay. So while others are trying to put together their questions, I have a little question. Let me ask now as a layman. I say one question that most people ask about African philosophy, which might also concern the area of metaphysics, is what makes African metaphysics different or unique? Why don't we just address it Western, Eastern, Southern metaphysics? Why can't we just group all together and call it metaphysics? What is that distinctive feature of African metaphysics? How would you address that kind of question?
All right, thank you. I think that what many African philosophers have tried to identify as the unique feature of African metaphysics is the relationality, but the sense of relationality that makes our understanding of the world, more comprehensible from a communal point of view is what I think has been emphasized by many African scholars on metaphysics. But again, it is a debate that we can have because, like you have rightly noted, it is possible for us to simply group all of this together and say, this is metaphysics. Yes, people simply have diverse interpretations. After all, just as I have mentioned earlier, even Aristotle was a bit divergent from his mentor, Plato, in his conception. So I really do not know whether we need to emphasize differences along geographical lines. But I think one of the reasons why we keep talking about the notion of African metaphysics is that, traditional scholarship has, tended to portray inquiries into the nature of existence or into the nature of being as if it is something exclusive to Westerners. And so the emphasis on African metaphysics, Asian metaphysics, Indian metaphysics is for people who were colonized, who were subjugated, to push back and say that we want to resist this narrative. Because when you read a book that introduces you to philosophy and then says metaphysical contemplation began with Thales, and then Anaximander and Anaximenes followed him, what we are trying to create then is a sort of epistemic hierarchy, and I think that it is the push to resist this kind of narrative that has led to us, bifurcating. And that is the reason why, because the discrimination against Africans, the idea that Africans, before our contact with Westerners, were people who had no capacity to contemplate, is also one of the reasons why we've lumped these together. Because otherwise, you will see that even within Africa, there are subtle nuances, and differences in the ways in which we conceive what metaphysics or morality or any aspect of philosophy entails. But as a philosophy of resistance, we tend to bring all of these together and then begin to instantiate between, okay, so this is how the Yoruba people see it, this is how the Akan people see it. If you go to Igbo culture, this is how it manifests. We acknowledge those differences, but for the purpose of standing together in unison to reject the epistemic injustice embedded in the Western narrative, we come together to say, oh, this is African metaphysics. I do not know if it's an answer that suffices, but I think that that is one very strong push in my view, why we will continue to have this bifurcation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that response. I think it suffices for now. I'm open to taking questions from the audience now. If you're ready with your question, please raise your hands and you can ask your question now. I'm also looking out for questions in the comment section, and I can't find any so far. Are there questions? Please, you're encouraged to interact, ask question, also network. This is an opportunity for networking to connect with other scholars in your field, so that you can build a relationship that will last beyond the summer school. Are there questions? Anyone? We're about to wrap this session up. Any question? Okay. We have William wants to raise a question. Yes, please go ahead, Williams.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you for the beautiful presentation you made so far. My question perhaps builds on the first one, which relates to the distinctness of African metaphysics. And I think from your presentation, what we got so far has to do with distinguishing African metaphysics from, say, the Western, by the supposition that in the African metaphysical world, to be is to be relational, or reality is fundamentally relational, as against the Western system in which reality is constituted by distinct, individually enclosed existence. But I was wondering if that distinction is categorical or it is merely explanatory. If I'll explain a bit so that my question will be clearer. So you realize that to assume that reality is relational does not deny the individuality of existence. It only says that over and beyond the individuality of existence, beings are so socially connected that it would be inadequate to explain them without giving fundamentality or explanatory fundamentality to their social embeddedness or their social situation. So in this context, it only appears that African metaphysics only give a further step of explanation that to be is to be relational is not something that marks African metaphysics off, but something that only says that African metaphysics gives a further explanation to being by giving fundamentality to its sociality, or if you like, its embeddedness. So in that regard, it appears to me that to the extent that that distinction is merely explanatory and not categorical, it hardly marks African metaphysics off as something that is quite distinct from others. That is something I wanted to invite your comment and thoughts on.
Thank you very much, William. I think we have both said the same thing, that the emphasis on the idea of African metaphysics as a body of thought derives a lot of fire from the valid need to push back against ethnocentric, against the Eurocentric assumption that Africans are incapable of contemplation and thought. The first thing I mentioned was that African scholars have argued that relationality differentiates African metaphysics. But yes, you have extended further to say that the notion of relationality does not necessarily obviate individuality. But I will even build on that to say that even in Western thought, when we consider the discussion, the argument between methodological individualist and holist, a kind of disputation that leads, that flows from metaphysical assumptions from the time of the likes of Hegel, down to the works of like the likes of Duhem, J.S. Mill and all of that. You see a tension between those who try to explain reality in terms of the primacy of the individual and those who say that no, you've got to comprehend the whole. So those who argue from the atomic point of view, who says that an entity is self-explanatory, and that when you bring separate atomic entities together, they do not necessarily take on a property that is outside and beyond of themselves. That is countered by the holists, who say no. When you bring different entities together, the nature of the relationship that occurs now lead to certain manifestations and the emergence of some properties, that you ordinarily wouldn't have found in the distinct elements were they to have been left, separate. So, like you have said, yes, for explanatory purposes, yeah, this is good. But ultimately, you will see that the individuality that we see, that some scholars seek to suppress in African scholarship, actually exists, and that the holist approach, the communal approach that we often try to present as non-existence in Western philosophy is also there. It is just that the individualists, seem to have been more popular. They seem to have, carried the day in terms of being overwhelming in their assertions. So I agree with you.
All right, Dr. Oyekan, please, can you just make it briefer? We have a few more questions so that we can see if we can accommodate some of them before the next lecture.
So the way to emphasize it is that what is going to help us is for us to have an intercultural approach to both metaphysics and indeed any form of scholarly engagement, because I believe that different cultures have numerous things to benefit one from the other. What is emphasized in one tradition at a certain point may differ from what is emphasized in another, but ultimately there can be no denying the fact that the rationality, so the quest for knowing, runs through all cultures. Thank you.
All right. Please, let's try to take. Ivan, can you be very brief with your question so that we see if we can take one more on the comment section?
Yes. Can you hear me? I'm trying to
All
launch
right.
my
Yes, we
video,
can hear you.
but oh, there we go. Yes. I have a question. Right now, developing and governing AI is almost increasingly being driven by a principle-based approach. And these principles are almost solely or exclusively extracted from Western Enlightenment thinking, based around these individual liberties and so on. Now, you have articulated very clearly why you think that's not all-encompassing. I just wanted you to see if we could synthesize principles from what you're saying, from African philosophical thought, that you feel are not covered by a lot of these major AI principles that are increasingly being advanced as a way we should build AI. And maybe we could start advocating for some of those principles that will reflect our Africanness and our outlook.
All right, Dr. Oyekan, your mic is off. Please unmute yourself and respond.
Okay, so if I understand you very well, you are wondering whether it is possible for us as Africans to have a something that is rational in our response to the emergence of AI. Well, it is something that I think we should explore, because as I've argued elsewhere, there has been a contest of ideas. The contest between ideas, principles, and values show that individualism, capitalism, market profits, technologism, when you group all these allied concepts together, they appear to be winning. And that does not necessarily mean that there are no pushbacks, even in Western societies, against these ideas, but they happen to be winning. And because Africa has not, reached that level of, material development that the West has. So Africa has been contaminated enough, but yet it is not up there. So Africa does not define the agenda. What we can then begin to do is to begin to see how we can become relevant in the emerging field of AI, such that we can then begin to train our people, invest in our people in such ways that we can build the type of AIs that will mirror and reflect our values, because every technological innovation is regarded and underpinned by some normative assumptions, and sometimes even some metaphysical assumptions. Or otherwise, we are going to watch the West define what AI should do and what it cannot, and we will remain passive consumers as always.
Dr.
And of course, that has very great importance for how we see the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's just see, but you have to be very fast in order for us to take this. Just one question here in the comment section. That is from Willem. It says, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Oyekan. Okay, the question is, would it be fair to say that African metaphysics lends itself more to pantheism or panpsychism than perhaps dualism or materialism? Or do you think it is still separate from those ideas? Do you have a brief response to that?
I'm afraid that's one that will take a whole lot of time, so yeah, it again, it reflects, divergence in the way we see these things. So if you see the works of Arabia and Thaddeus Metz, for instance, they have a view that differs from the pantheistic leaning of many popular African scholars who have worked on this area, and you see emerging ones like Ufasi and all of that. They also have their different takes. So the idea we cannot homogenize African intellectual thought at this level. I think we are beginning to see healthy contentions between African scholars on the meanings and interpretations of all of these things. And the position nationally, of course, but in summation, to say that it is either here or there is something that I find a little bit problematic. I think that it's about which argument persuades us more, but there are diverse approaches to some of these things. As we continue to see more scholarly works emerge. So I do not want us to straitjacket, African metaphysics into either panpsychism or dualism or pantheism. I think that the approaches are divergent now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that response. I can see our second lecturer, Professor Molefe, is trying to join. So while we are still waiting for him, I think maybe we can accommodate one more question. So let's go to the comment section. Why is there an introduction of African metaphysics without referring to Western thoughts? Do you get the question?
I'm not sure I do. Because
Okay.
yeah, I'm not sure.
Please, if you
I'm not.
can rephrase the
I'm not.
question, Miriam, it would be.
Yeah. Because what I tried to do, what I've tried to do is to balance, the introduction in ways that move from Western to African to Eastern, and then present this. Perhaps the person who asked the question joined us a little bit late, but I think that we tried to straddle, diverse traditions to ensure that we didn't privilege one over the other. So in a 40-minute session like this, if it appeared towards the end that my emphasis was more on the African, well, I apologize. But if you had been here from the beginning, you will see that I spent quite a lot of time on Thales, Anaximenes, Anaximander, Aristotle, before we arrived at the notion of destiny and its implications in African thought. And I think I eventually ended with Sat, if I recall. So
all right, thank you. So let's get the next one while Professor Molefe is trying to join us. Thanks for the presentation. It's from Solomon Ayesan. My question is, considering the diversity of African society, why do we continue to view African metaphysics as a single entity? Is African metaphysics really just one? That's the question.
Well, I think, maybe this question was asked before I made my penultimate comment, to the effect that there is a limit to which you can, have a straitjacketed view of African scholarship. To borrow the words of Kwame Appiah, Africa is many. So for the sake of convenience, yes, we do group these ideas together. Thaddeus Mez will say that one thing that runs through them is the notion of relationality. So it makes them, maybe siblings, so to speak, if we look at these ideas. But the truth of the matter is that the same way in which we group Western thinking together is the same way we do, for African thought. So the philosophy of Aristotle builds on that of Plato, but, there are vast differences, but yet we all refer to it as Greek philosophy. We refer to it all as Western philosophy, even though we know that the works of Aristotle differ from that of Hegel and Kant. We still lump all of this together as Western philosophy. I think it's just for the purpose of, convenience sometimes, and for us to identify certain trends that unite some of these lines of thought. But I agree with you that it is important for us to also continue to question dominant narratives that earlier scholars have presented as representative of African views, whether it's in the area of metaphysics, ethics, politics, or epistemology. Because the truth of the matter is that even in those days, in traditional African societies where people could not write, ideas contested with themselves. I always tell people, when you look at Yoruba proverbs, for almost every proverb that you have a counter proverb that negates the one that you have just rendered. And so, but some of these proverbs became more popular than others. And so when people collect a few proverbs and say, oh, these proverbs are representative of what the Yoruba people think on a particular issue, I will say, no, there is the flip side to it. And I think that was what Sophie Oluwole tried to emphasize when she kept talking about binary thinking. That, okay, so the wisdom of today is the foolishness of tomorrow. So there is no form of absolutism. So within cultures and between cultures in Africa, there are diversity, divergences in expressions and the substance of those ideas. So yes, we can continue to categorize African thought or African scholarship as different from Western scholarship, but we should set boundaries, and within the context that we are using such terminologies, we should be able to define what exactly we mean when we use them, rather than weaving them, without restriction. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for that brilliant presentation and very detailed response to question. We really appreciate it. The other questions, I think you can address them in the comment section. You can respond to them directly while we move on to the next lecture.